You might have thought that being a noble woman in the Middle Ages was a privilege. You imagined grand feasts, elegant gowns, and tall stone castles. But in reality, things were not as pleasant as they seem. Being a noblewoman meant living a life that had been decided for you long before you could speak, and ending it in fatigue, illness, or quiet isolation. From the moment a child was born, her gender determined her path. If she was a girl, her noble family didn't see her as someone with dreams or choices, but rather as a tool for making alliances. Marriage was not for love. It was a transaction, a way to gain land, power, or favor. A noble girl might be promised to another noble family before she could even walk. And by the age of 12 or 14, she might already be a wife. The man she married could be 2 or even 3 times her age. She did not choose him. She was not asked what she wanted. It simply happened because it was expected. Her education was designed with one goal in mind: to make her suitable, not to think deeply, not to question, but to obey. She was taught to sew, to keep the household running, to remain silent, and to smile politely. A few girls learned Latin or how to read religious texts, but most did not. Their world was small, and it was meant to stay that way. She learned how to walk gracefully, how to kneel properly in church, how to serve her husband and never speak out of turn. She was taught that obedience was a virtue and silence was strength. Life in a castle may sound luxurious, but it was often cold, damp, and uncomfortable. Stone walls held in the chill. Windows were tiny, letting in little light. There were no fireplaces in most rooms, and the furniture was heavy and stiff. Bathing was rare. Toilets were simple holes in the ground or wooden seats above a pit. There was no clean running water, no soap as we know it, and no real privacy. Heavy gowns layered over each other made it hard to move freely. Getting dressed required a servant's help. Corsets pressed tight against the ribs. The air felt heavy. Sometimes even breathing became effortful. If a noblewoman gave birth to a son, she might gain a little more respect. A male heir meant the family name and property would continue. But if she gave birth to a daughter, she could be blamed. Even though the science of reproduction was not understood, she bore the weight of failure. Pregnancy was not safe. There were no trained doctors, no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and childbirth often took place in dark, unclean rooms surrounded by superstition and prayer. If something went wrong, there was little help. Women died in labor. Babies did not survive, and life went on because it had to. Religion shaped every part of her life. She was told to obey God, her father, her husband, and eventually her son. The church praised the ideal woman, quiet, pure, obedient. Stories of saints and martyrs were used as examples, women who gave up everything and suffered in silence. If she questioned her role, it was considered sinful. If she spoke too boldly, she was seen as dangerous. Even kindness had to be measured to avoid suspicion. Her virtue was her value. Her silence was her strength. Her suffering was expected. As she grew older, her duties never stopped. She oversaw servants. She raised children. She watched over the estate when her husband was away at war or in court. But she had little freedom. She could not travel freely. She could not own property in her own name. She could not vote, speak in council, or choose her own path. If her husband died, she might be sent to a convent, or forced to remarry, or left to live in quiet, forgotten corners of the estate. All of this was just the beginning. We haven't even talked about the expectations of court life, the restrictions on female friendships, or the punishments for stepping out of line. But we'll explore it all, slowly, gently. For now, just breathe. Let your mind drift back to that old, heavy world where silence was survival and being born noble was not always a gift. The wedding day of a noblewoman was not filled with joy. It was filled with duty. For many girls, marriage came before they had time to become themselves. One day she was a child, the next a wife. There were no romantic proposals. There was no time for falling in love. Everything had been arranged by fathers, uncles, lords. She was exchanged like a prize, given away like land. Sometimes she did not even know the man she would marry. She might meet him on the wedding day. He could be older, a widower, or a stranger with cold eyes. The ceremony was quick. A priest gave his blessing. Vows were spoken in Latin. And then it was done. A girl had become a wife. After the ceremony, there was the bedding ritual. Servants or witnesses might stand nearby. It was meant to prove the marriage was real, to ensure heirs would be legitimate. It was not tender. It was not kind. It was something endured. And from that moment, her life belonged to her husband. He could decide where she lived, what she wore, what she said. He could beat her for disobedience, and no one would stop him. It was not illegal, it was expected. She had no right to refuse him, not in bed, not in conversation, not in presence. Her body was not her own, her voice was not her own, and her future had never truly been hers. In public, she was expected to smile, to stand by her husband and look graceful, to represent the family with dignity. But she was rarely asked what she thought or how she felt. Her value came from being agreeable. Her silence made others comfortable. At court, she had to be cautious. She could not speak freely. She could not be too clever. Wit in a woman was seen as dangerous. If she laughed too loud, she was vulgar. If she stayed too quiet, she was cold. If she was friendly with men, she was scandalous. If she was distant, she was ungrateful. No matter what she did, someone disapproved. So she learned to fold inward, to disappear politely. Other women could be dangerous too. Gossip traveled fast. Jealousy ran deep. Friendships were shallow, polite, and full of performance. Behind every smile was a question. Behind every compliment, a calculation. She could not trust easily, and she had nowhere to go. There were no safe spaces, no therapists, no letters that could not be opened, no privacy that wasn't earned by absolute obedience. Even in moments of quiet, she was watched by servants, by other women, by priests, by the expectations she carried on her shoulders. If her husband was kind, life was easier. But kindness was not guaranteed. He might leave for war and never return. He might take mistresses. He might spend money recklessly, and she would be left to manage the estate. She could not own it, not fully, but she was expected to keep it running. She had to supervise workers, manage harvests, settle small disputes, all while raising children, pleasing in-laws, and maintaining the illusion of a happy home. No breaks, no thanks, no reward. Just duty. Always duty. Even if she did everything right, she could still be cast aside. If she failed to produce sons, if she aged too quickly, if someone whispered a false rumor, her life could collapse overnight. She could be locked away, sent to a convent, or simply forgotten. A noble woman's life was never her own. It was borrowed, leased, tied to others' ambitions. And though history forgets most of their names, their quiet suffering built the walls of those grand castles. It kept lineages alive. It held kingdoms together, all without applause. The life of a noblewoman in the Middle Ages was not only confined by rigid social expectations, but also governed by countless strict routines in her daily existence. Every meal, every glance, every step beyond the chamber followed a set protocol, written or unwritten. It was as if she were an actor in a play for which she had never auditioned, reading lines she did not write, performing for an audience that never applauded. Food, though seemingly abundant, came with many limitations. Despite their high status, noblewomen were rarely free to eat as they pleased. Their meals were dictated by the seasons, religious obligations, and household hierarchy. On many holy days, they had to fast or eat plain food, even when their bodies were weary. During banquets, they sat upright, spoke only when addressed, and ate with controlled, deliberate motions, never too fast, never too slow, lest the family's reputation be tarnished. Even the way they held their spoons or sipped from a goblet was scrutinized. A simple misstep, like spilling a drop of wine, could be remembered and gossiped about for weeks. Personal hygiene was no less constrained. The castles were cold, and the bathing facilities were crude. Water was precious, and washing the hair was often only done a few times a month. A noblewoman would sit still for hours, while her handmaidens slowly untangled and brushed her long hair, an uncomfortable and tiresome process. Yet complaints were frowned upon. To complain was to appear fragile, and fragility was weakness. Baths, when they did occur, were often ceremonial. Rose petals, herbs, or oils might be added, not just for fragrance, but to mask the infrequency. Still, these moments of luxury were fleeting and often overshadowed by the ever-present chill of stone walls and unheated rooms. Clothing, too, was a daily trial. The layers of gowns were heavy and restrictive, designed more for appearances than comfort. Dressing each morning could take hours. The garments had to be flawless, no creases, no stray threads. Every fold and ribbon was a statement of her family's dignity. A single wrinkle could speak volumes about one's upbringing. Corsets, tight bodices, and stiff collars made movement difficult. Even sitting comfortably became an exercise in posture. The weight of the fabrics pressed down on her shoulders, not unlike the weight of expectation she carried every day. Beyond domestic duties, noblewomen were expected to serve as living symbols of their family's honor. Their emotions had to be masked at all times. If they felt sorrow, they smiled. If they felt anger, they remained quiet. Everything about their presence was carefully curated, as if their soul were locked behind a wall of etiquette and silence. Some found solace in poetry or embroidery, pouring pieces of themselves into the stitches or verses, quiet rebellions that no one would ever read aloud. Others wrote letters, never sent, to people they once knew or dreams they had long since buried. These small acts were lifelines, moments where they remembered they were more than titles and gowns and duties. Their social world was also an endless maze. They had to be charming without seeming bold, intelligent without appearing too opinionated. A misjudged word, a poorly timed smile, or a glance held too long could stir rumors and judgment. Every interaction was a performance. Courtyards, dining halls, and prayer chambers were all stages upon which they were expected to move with grace and subtlety, never drawing too much attention, yet never appearing indifferent. At night, when the castle grew still, and the wind whispered through the stone corridors, a strange coldness settled into the air. Alone in a grand room, lit by a flickering candle, she would lie awake staring into the darkness. No one ever asked what she truly wanted. No one cared what she once dreamed of. And in that silence she slowly faded, not from age, but from forgetting herself, becoming a shadow upon the cold stone walls of history. Her thoughts wandered to simpler things, a warm sunbeam on the floor, the sound of birds in spring, the smell of bread baking. These memories flickered like fading stars, distant and unreachable, and yet they lingered. They were all that remained of a self once curious, once hopeful. No one carved her name into legends. No songs were sung of her quiet strength, her silent endurance, or the countless days she lived without thanks or joy. But within the stillness there was something dignified in her survival, a quiet resilience, a steadfast breath taken, day after day, beneath the heavy fabric of duty and silence.
Marriages for noblewomen were rarely about love. They were transactions, exchanges of land, power, titles, and alliances. From a very young age, girls of noble birth were groomed not to dream of romance, but to prepare for duty. By the time they were 12 or 13, discussions would begin. Suitors would be evaluated not by character or kindness, but by the strategic value they offered to the family. Often, noble women were married off to men decades older than themselves, men they barely knew or had never met. These unions were arranged in formal settings, sometimes without the bride even being present for the negotiations. And when the day came, she was dressed in elaborate garments, her hair braided and crowned, her expression expected to be serene. But inside, many were terrified. They were leaving behind everything they had known: friends, family, the familiar walls of their childhood homes, for a future dictated by unfamiliar faces and unfamiliar rules. Once married, a noblewoman's new household became her entire world. She was expected to serve her husband, manage the estate in his absence, bear children, and maintain the family's honor. The pressure to produce heirs, especially sons, was immense. A woman's worth was often judged not by her intelligence or loyalty, but by the number of healthy boys she could deliver into the world. If she failed, whispers followed her down every corridor. If she succeeded, the credit often went to her husband's strength or the will of God. Pregnancy was both a duty and a danger. Medical knowledge was limited, and childbirth was fraught with risk. Midwives did what they could, but even in the grandest castles, there were no guarantees. Every labor carried with it the quiet fear that this might be the last. and yet there was little space for fear. A noblewoman was expected to be brave, composed, and grateful. Gratitude was a requirement even in suffering. Motherhood was not always gentle. While some noblewomen were allowed to raise their own children, many were not. Sons might be sent to foster with other noble families to learn discipline and knightly virtues. Daughters, too, were often raised by governesses, trained from an early age in the same cycle of obedience, elegance, and quiet sacrifice. The bond between mother and child was a fragile thing, easily disrupted by the politics of inheritance and the rigid structures of aristocratic life. Even the idea of love, tender, mutual love, was distant for many noblewomen. Marital affection, if it existed, was a fortunate accident. Some women grew to respect their husbands, others merely tolerated them. And a few, quietly, held on to memories of someone else, someone they had loved in youth but had been forbidden to marry. These memories faded with time, buried beneath duty and years, but on quiet nights they might rise again, like whispers in the dark. Social life for a married noblewoman was full of rules and careful maneuvering. She might attend feasts, host guests, or organize religious events, but always with a sense of caution. Every word she spoke could be interpreted. Every friendship could be questioned. She had to be charming but modest, intelligent but deferential, visible but not too visible. Her life was a dance upon a polished floor, where missteps echoed loudly. For many, the only refuge came in private rituals. Evening prayers whispered at a window, letters written in secret, embroidery that carried hidden messages, time spent in the garden, where for a moment she could feel the sun without performing. In these quiet spaces, some sense of self could survive, not loudly, not boldly, but softly, like the scent of lavender pressed between pages of an old book. The church offered both comfort and control. Noblewomen were expected to be devout, attending Mass regularly, confessing sins, donating to religious causes. Some found genuine solace in faith. Others clung to religion as their only form of agency. A few, unable to bear the weight of marriage or its demands, sought escape by entering convents. Within the walls of a nunnery, a woman could find a different kind of life, still bound by duty, but free from marriage and motherhood. For some, it was the first time they were allowed to simply exist without being defined by a man. Yet not all noblewomen suffered in silence. Some found ways to influence politics, subtly guiding decisions through their husbands or sons. Others became patrons of the arts, commissioning music, poetry, or architecture. These small acts of agency often went uncredited, yet they shaped the world in quiet, profound ways. It was resistance not through rebellion, but through persistence. Still, for every woman who found a path of influence, there were countless others whose names have been forgotten. Women who lived entire lives of constraint and sacrifice, who did what was expected of them without recognition or reward. Their stories were not recorded in books or sung in ballads, but they existed, and in their endurance there was an unspoken power, one that survives in the faint outlines of history, like ink that has faded on an ancient page.
While the world outside continued to turn, with battles, treaties, and shifting borders. The life of a noblewoman remained unchanged. Her world was smaller, more controlled, filled with quiet repetition. The seasons passed not with adventure, but with routine. Harvest festivals, winter fasts, spring pilgrimages, and long, idle summers. Her days were measured by bells and candles, not by freedom or change. Each morning began the same way. The sound of a servant at her door, the cold stone floors beneath her feet, the careful layering of garments one over another, while the air remained damp and heavy. Then prayers, spoken aloud or whispered silently, asking for strength, health, or perhaps just a moment of peace. And so the day unfolded, one slow step at a time. In the halls of the castle, she walked with purpose, but not haste. To move too quickly was considered unladylike. To speak too loudly, a sign of weakness. Her voice was calm, her gestures graceful, even when her thoughts wandered far from the tasks at hand. She listened to reports from the steward, gave instructions to the servants, ensured that the kitchen had enough grain and the stores enough wine. These responsibilities were hers to carry, but the credit seldom was. Visitors came and went. Courtiers, clerics, soldiers, and wandering minstrels. She welcomed them with polite smiles, measured words, and a table set with formality. Sometimes they brought news from distant lands, tales of crusades, uprisings, or royal weddings. But these stories were always about others, about men. The noblewoman listened, nodded, and returned to her work, her own story, still unwritten. There were times when she felt the world shifting around her, even if she remained still. A new alliance formed. A neighboring lord died. A distant cousin claimed a throne. Each change brought new rules, new dangers. A single war could take her husband, her sons, or her home. And yet she endured as she always had, adjusting without complaint, like a candle bending to the draught in the room. Holidays offered some variation, though not freedom. On feast days, she oversaw the preparation of banquets, ordering the slaughter of animals, the baking of bread, the brewing of ale. She arranged the placement of guests, the decoration of the hall, and the music to be played. She watched from her seat at the table, smiling at the laughter of others, while calculating how many coins had been spent and whether the stores could survive the winter. Her joy was never the priority. Her presence was. In moments of solitude, she turned to small comforts, a worn book, though she might not be allowed to own many. A psalm, memorized and recited quietly. A piece of embroidery left half-finished on her lap. These were her companions, along with the flicker of firelight and the hum of wind against the windows. Sometimes she imagined a different life, not a grand one, just one where she could choose what to read, where to walk, how to spend an afternoon. But choices were luxuries she had never been promised. Even in widowhood, freedom was uncertain. Some noble women found brief independence after their husbands' deaths, managing estates and directing servants without interference. Others were quickly remarried, their hands and fortunes passed from one man to another, like pages in a ledger. The law rarely protected them. Their value was tied to titles and dowries, not to their thoughts or desires. For those who remained unmarried or childless, the path was even narrower. Some were sent to convents, where silence and discipline replaced the noise of court life. Others lived in the households of male relatives, serving as caretakers or tutors, never quite belonging, always one step removed from the center. Even with wealth and shelter, their position was fragile, dependent on the goodwill of others. A single accusation, a single scandal, and their safety could vanish. Friendship was rare, but not impossible. Bonds were formed in shared glances, in long hours spent together in quiet rooms, in letters exchanged over years and distances. These friendships, though often restrained by decorum, offered warmth in a cold world. A kind word, a shared memory, or a secret joke might carry a noblewoman through weeks of isolation. These were the treasures no ledger recorded. As the years passed, her body aged under the weight of stillness. Knees stiffened, eyes dimmed, fingers once nimble with needle and thread began to tremble. But the expectations never lessened. She still had to rise early, dress properly, speak with dignity. There was no rest, no retirement, only slower movements and longer nights. In old age, she might be remembered as a matriarch, a figure of respect, if not affection. Her wisdom was sought, though only if it did not conflict with younger men's ambitions. Her presence was honored, though her thoughts remained politely ignored. She watched the next generation repeat the same patterns: arranged marriages, dutiful smiles, silent endurance. And she wondered if anything would ever truly change. When she looked in the mirror, she sometimes did not recognize the woman staring back. The youthful girl with bright eyes and a curious mind had vanished, replaced by a quiet stranger with careful hands and tired lips. And yet, within that reflection, there was still a trace of strength, something unbreakable beneath the layers of silk and silence. She was not a queen. She was not a warrior. She was not remembered in songs. But she endured. She adapted. She survived.
Even within the stone walls of a castle, life for a noblewoman was not always comfortable. Though her garments were rich, they were heavy and often stiff. Though her rooms were private, they were rarely warm. In winter, drafts slipped in through the windows, chilling the bones. Fires burned in the hearth, but smoke sometimes clung to the ceiling beams, filling the air with a bitter scent. She wrapped herself in furs and wool, but still her fingers remained cold. The servants brought hot water in basins, but baths were rare. Cleanliness was difficult, privacy even more so. She had chambers of her own, yes, but not entirely her own. Servants came and went. Maids dressed and undressed her. Others tended the fire, brought meals, brushed her hair. Her life, though isolated, was never entirely solitary. There was always someone watching, listening, ready to report. A noblewoman had little space to think aloud or express herself freely. Every sigh could be misinterpreted. Every tear had to be wiped quickly. Her wardrobe, so often admired, was not a comfort. Layers of linen, wool, and silk were arranged with care, each with symbolic purpose. Certain colors were reserved for feast days, others for mourning. Her girdles and veils spoke of wealth, but also duty. Tight corsets restricted her movement. Long skirts dragged on cold stone floors. Beauty was an obligation. Discomfort was expected. And if she dared to protest, she was told it was unbecoming. Education for noblewomen was practical, not philosophical. She was taught how to manage a household, how to read religious texts, how to write a careful letter. She learned to sing, to play a simple instrument, to dance with grace. She knew the names of saints and feast days, the proper way to greet a bishop or a visiting noble. But deeper learning, history, mathematics, the sciences, was often kept from her. Those were things for men. If she asked too many questions, eyebrows were raised. Curiosity, after all, was not considered a virtue for women. Her opinions, if she had them, were to be kept quiet. At council tables, she sat behind or beside her husband, never at the head. In church, she knelt quietly, eyes lowered, hands folded. Her prayers were between her and God, and sometimes they were all she had. In the garden, she might whisper her thoughts to the wind, but in public, she smiled, nodded, and listened. Her silence was misunderstood for contentment. Ceremony shaped her world. Every birth, marriage, and death came with rituals, some comforting, some burdensome. At baptisms, she stood beside the font,
cradling infants too small to know what fate awaited them. At weddings, she arranged flowers and gifts, even if the bride wept. At funerals, she wore black, walked slowly, and held back tears. Emotion was permitted, but only in controlled doses. A noblewoman had to be dignified, even in grief. Religious devotion filled the gaps of daily life. She visited chapels, gave alms, and recited prayers at fixed hours. On certain nights she fasted. On others she stayed awake in vigil. The church was both a guide and a cage. It offered comfort, but also judgment. It told her to obey, to endure, to suffer with grace. It reminded her that her body was weak and her soul in need of constant correction. But sometimes, in the stillness of candlelight, she felt something deeper, something like peace. Letters were her secret lifeline. When aloud, she wrote carefully, with a steady hand, on parchment cut thin. Her words were formal, never too emotional, but between the lines she poured her feelings. She wrote to sisters in distant castles, to daughters married far away, to old friends now living behind convent walls. These letters took weeks or months to arrive, and sometimes they were lost. But when a reply came, it was treasured, read and reread in silence. She learned the art of waiting, waiting for news, waiting for permission, waiting for someone to return from war or pilgrimage, waiting for a child to recover from fever, waiting for winter to end. Her life was made of intervals and pauses, of time stretched thin and slow. And in that waiting, she grew older without realizing it. Visitors sometimes praised her for her composure. They called her noble, gracious, serene. They admired the way she kept her household in order, how she managed so many things with apparent ease. But they did not see the weight behind her eyes. They did not hear the thoughts she silenced before speaking. They did not know the dreams she had once dared to imagine, long buried beneath layers of obligation. She rarely traveled far. Journeys were difficult, dangerous, and disruptive. When she did leave the castle, it was often for a family gathering, a religious duty, or a political necessity. Carriages bounced along muddy roads. Inns were crowded and noisy. Illnesses spread easily. Travel was no escape. It was just another version of duty. In her quiet moments, she turned to storytelling, not to write her own story, but to pass along the tales she had heard, stories of saints and martyrs, of queens and knights, of enchanted forests and lost kingdoms. She told these to children seated at her feet, their eyes wide, their minds unburdened. And for a little while she was not a noblewoman. She was simply a voice in the dark, weaving a world more beautiful than her own. Nightfall came early in winter. The castle grew colder. Shadows crept along the walls. She lit candles one by one, then watched them flicker. Outside the wind howled. Inside she wrapped herself in quiet. She listened to the sounds of servants, of distant bells, of her own breathing, and she wondered what tomorrow would bring, if anything new or simply more of the same. But even in the sameness there was endurance. She endured not because she was weak, but because she had no other choice. And in that endurance there was a kind of strength, quiet, steady, unseen.
Sometimes a noblewoman found herself at the center of things, not by choice, but by circumstance. When her husband left for war or pilgrimage, she remained behind to manage the estate. It was not considered unusual, but it was also not truly respected. The villagers brought their concerns to her, the steward reported to her, the servants waited for her commands. She signed letters, approved purchases, planned repairs. And yet, these decisions were always understood to be temporary. She was a placeholder, not a leader. The real power would return with the man. Still, she took the work seriously. She walked the fields with the bailiff, asked about the grain stores, checked on the cattle. She sat through disputes between tenants, listened patiently, then ruled carefully. Fairness was expected, but so was firmness. If she appeared too soft, she would lose control. If she was too stern, she would be disliked. It was a delicate balance, one she was never quite praised for mastering. Seasons moved slowly across her life. Spring brought the muddy thaw and the first green leaves. Summer was busy with planting and tending. Autumn meant harvests, preserving, storing. Winter came with stillness and firelight. Each season had its duties, and each returned with quiet certainty. There was comfort in the cycle, even if it offered little freedom. Time did not rush for her. It drifted, like mist rising from the river in the early morning. When illness struck, it struck without warning. There were no real doctors, only herbalists and traveling clerics. Remedies were made from roots and oils, wrapped in cloth and whispered over with prayers. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they did not. A fever could take a child in a single night. A cough could linger for weeks. She had buried infants before they learned to speak. She had watched her own strength falter after childbirth. There were no guarantees in a noblewoman's life, not even with wealth. Childbearing was both duty and danger. A noblewoman was expected to produce heirs, strong sons to inherit land and titles. Each pregnancy was a gamble. Midwives did their best, but they had few tools. There were herbs to ease the pain, charms to protect the child, and prayers whispered until the final push. Sometimes the child survived. Sometimes both mother and child did not. And when she survived, she often faced the expectation to try again soon. Grief was a luxury. Duty was not. Even those who bore many children were not always praised.
If she had too many daughters, she was pitied. If she failed to produce a son, she was blamed. The fault was assumed to be hers, regardless of science. Her body was scrutinized, her fertility questioned, her worth tied to outcomes she could not control. And still, she smiled. Still, she carried on. Sometimes, a noblewoman outlived her husband. The grief could be real or simply expected. Regardless of her feelings, she dressed in black, kept her head lowered, and observed mourning rituals. Her future became uncertain. If her children were grown, she might move to a smaller manor or join a convent. If her son was still young, she might serve as regent, another temporary role, another position soon taken from her. Widowhood was not liberation. It was a different kind of waiting. In some rare cases, she found moments of quiet happiness, watching the sunrise over the fields, holding her child's hand, laughing with an old friend, reading a line of scripture that comforted her heart. These were not celebrated moments, not recorded in any chronicle, but to her they were real. They were the parts of life that felt closest to freedom. Poetry sometimes reached her ears, verses about brave knights, fair maidens, tragic love. She knew better than to believe them. Courtly love was a game, one she sometimes had to play. A knight might declare his admiration, offer a song or a favor, but it was all ceremony, nothing more. Real love was quieter, rarer, and often unspoken. If she found it at all, it was in small glances, in shared burdens, in trust that endured without flourish. Music echoed through the halls on feast days, harps, lutes, soft flutes. The melodies were slow, the lyrics ancient. She listened not for entertainment, but for the comfort of something familiar, a tune she had heard as a child, now repeated by her daughter. A rhythm that soothed her even when her thoughts wandered far. Music did not change her world, but it reminded her she was still alive in it. Legends were told beside the hearth, dragons, saints, lost kings. The stories passed through generations, shaped by voice and memory. She remembered hearing them as a child, her head on her nurse's lap. Now she told them to her grandchildren, watching their eyes grow wide in the firelight. The stories were not hers, but she carried them, like a candle in the night. She did not expect to be remembered. Her name might appear in a marriage contract or on the corner of a family tree, but her thoughts, her fears, her small victories, those would vanish with her. That was the way of things. Men built cathedrals, women maintained silence. And yet, in that silence, there was life. There was care, effort, resilience. She held a world together that others walked through without seeing. In the final years, she moved more slowly. Her hands shook when she reached for her cup. Her knees ached when she knelt in prayer. Her voice was softer, but her eyes remained sharp. She noticed things others missed: a servant's quiet sadness, a child's hesitation, the subtle shift in seasons. She had spent a lifetime observing without being asked, listening without being heard. When death approached, she did not resist. She had prepared for it, spoken of it, prayed about it. Her will was written, her burial dress chosen. Her soul, she hoped, was ready. She asked for no great monument, just a small stone, a quiet prayer, a candle lit now and then. And then one evening, with the wind brushing the shutters and the fire burning low, she closed her eyes. There was no grand farewell, no final proclamation, just silence. But the life she lived, the quiet, unseen, patient life, left traces in the rooms she had managed, the people she had fed, the hands she had held, in the generations that followed, even if they forgot her name. She had endured. She had shaped a world through steadiness, not spectacle.
While the life of a noblewoman was bound by the walls of her estate, it was also shaped by the distant politics of courts and kings. Her marriage, her children's futures, and even her day-to-day routines were often determined by people she had never met. Royal decrees could change the laws she lived under. Alliances made or broken through noble families could shift her entire world. Yet she had little say in any of it. She was informed, not consulted. And so she adapted, as she always did. When a summons came from the court, often carried by a courier on horseback, sealed in wax, she prepared to leave. The journey could take days, sometimes weeks, depending on the weather and the state of the roads. Her carriage jolted over uneven paths, and she wrapped herself in layers to keep out the cold. Inns were drafty and loud. Food was simple and often stale. She missed her bed, her routine, her quiet corners. Upon arrival, the court dazzled with noise and color. Velvet gowns, gold embroidery, perfumed rooms, voices that rose and fell in practiced tones. She walked among these people as if she belonged, and in name she did. But in truth, it was a game of masks. Smiles could not be trusted. Compliments often hid warnings. A wrong word might lead to gossip, a wrong look to suspicion. She watched carefully, said little, and bowed often. At court, she was not only a wife, but a symbol. She represented her family's honor, her husband's power, and her children's futures. Her every action was observed. The way she curtsied, the way she dined, the way she greeted a duchess or a bishop, it all mattered. Mistakes were not easily forgiven, and yet she rarely received credit for getting it right. When court life exhausted her, she sought moments of solitude. A walk in the gardens, a prayer in the chapel, a quiet moment near a window, watching birds flit between trees. These brief respites gave her breath, though not freedom. She always returned to the chambers prepared for her, where her duties resumed without question. Some noblewomen gained favor at court, clever ones who knew how to flatter without fawning, who offered advice without overstepping. But favor was fragile. It could disappear with a rumor or a change in ruler. One day she might dine near the queen. The next she might be sent home in silence. The higher one rose, the harder the fall. And so many chose to stay quiet, unnoticed, steady. Her children, if brought to court, were also under scrutiny. A daughter's posture might be noted by potential suitors. A son's manners might be compared to others. She corrected gently but firmly, knowing that one careless gesture could alter their future. She tried to keep them grounded, even in such shallow soil. But children, like everyone, longed to be liked. They learned quickly how to wear masks too. There were events to attend, feasts, tournaments, weddings. She dressed carefully for each, her garments chosen not only for beauty, but for message. Colors spoke louder than words. A deep blue might show loyalty. Gold hinted at wealth. White could suggest piety. She sat through hours of conversation, of laughter that rang a little too loud, of performances that blurred together. Applause was expected, even if the music grated or the jesters bored her. Behind closed doors, politics churned like a restless sea. Marriages were arranged, titles negotiated, land passed between hands with little regard for the people living on it. She listened when allowed, offered opinions only when asked. And even then, she chose her words with care. A woman who said too much risked being labeled proud. One who said too little was dismissed as dull. There was no perfect position, only shifting ground beneath her feet. When it was finally time to leave the court and return home, she felt relief. The road was rough, the carriage cold, but the thought of her own hearth gave her strength. Home meant routines, familiar voices, her own way of doing things. She returned not to rest, but to work that felt more honest, more her own. She checked the household ledger, asked after the servants, looked in on the sick and the elderly. The chapel needed candles. The cook needed spices. The steward had questions about the fields. Her absence had been noted, and now her presence brought things back into order. It was a kind of power, quiet and essential. She wrote letters again, thanking those she had met, reminding others of promises made. Her handwriting was neat, her tone formal. She knew which phrases pleased, which words could gently nudge someone toward action. Her words traveled faster than she ever could, and sometimes they succeeded where speeches failed. In the evenings, she returned to her embroidery. Stitch by stitch, she created images of saints, vines, lions, stars. It was slow work, almost meditative. Her fingers moved with practiced rhythm. The fabric quieted her thoughts. When she finished a piece, she did not sign it, but it would hang in the chapel or be sewn into a ceremonial garment. Her work was seen, even if her name was not. Some nights she read by candlelight. Religious texts, yes, but even in the later years of her life, a noblewoman's responsibilities did not end. They simply changed shape. Her children had grown, some married, some gone to distant lands. The halls of her manor were quieter now, though not silent. Servants still moved through the corridors, and younger relatives sometimes came to stay. She no longer managed everything directly, but her presence continued to guide the rhythm of the household. People still looked to her, not for orders, but for approval, for steadiness. Her mornings began early, as they always had. She woke before the sun and sat by the window, wrapped in wool, her fingers resting on a cup of warm broth. The same view greeted her each day: the courtyard, the distant line of trees, the smoke rising from the kitchen. She had watched seasons pass through this same window for decades. Each change in the landscape was like the turning of a page she had already read many times, and yet she read it again. She prayed more often now, not out of fear, but out of habit. The prayers had once been memorized. Now they were felt. She lit candles for the departed, murmured blessings for those still living. The chapel was cool and dim, its stone walls lined with familiar icons. No one disturbed her there. It was the one place where time seemed to pause entirely. Meals were simpler than in her younger days. The feasts were fewer, the guests less grand. She ate slowly, with careful hands. Her appetite had changed, and so had her body. She moved with more caution, her steps measured, her grip not as firm, but her mind remained sharp. She noticed small things: how the steward hesitated before speaking, how a young maid's eyes were red from crying. She saw what others missed.
Sometimes visitors came to seek her counsel, not official advice, not legal matters, just quiet wisdom. A niece uncertain about a suitor, a priest unsure how to approach a quarrel in the village, a steward anxious about a poor harvest. They came to her not because she ruled, but because she had endured, and endurance, in its quiet way, had become her authority. She kept letters tied with ribbon in a wooden box, letters from her children, from old friends, even from her late husband. The ink had faded, but the words remained. She read them on rainy afternoons, her fingers tracing the curves of handwriting long gone. The letters spoke of ordinary things, weather, illness, small victories, shared memories. They were not important to history, but they were everything to her. Her world had grown smaller, but no less meaningful. She tended her garden when the weather allowed, gently pressing seeds into the soil with stiff fingers. She watched birds gather near the fountain. She taught her granddaughter how to mend a tear in linen, how to steep herbs for a sore throat. These moments were soft, unnoticed by the world, but they were what filled her days. She no longer feared being forgotten. There had been a time when she wondered if her life would leave no trace, but that worry had faded. She understood now that traces were not always visible. They lived in habits passed down, in traditions maintained, in the stories whispered before sleep. Her influence was quiet, like the turning of the seasons. It did not need to be seen to be real. In the evenings, she sometimes sat by the hearth and listened to the younger ones speak. They spoke of things she didn't fully understand, new customs, new songs, even new words. But she smiled, nodded, and occasionally offered a story of her own, a memory of when the river flooded, a tale about a horse that refused to be saddled, a moment from her childhood when her mother had carried her through the snow. The younger ones listened politely, perhaps not fully grasping the weight of the memories, but she did not mind. She spoke not to impress, but to remember. Winter was her favorite season now, not because of the cold, but because of the stillness. The snow muffled the world, softened the sounds of footsteps and voices. Fires burned longer. People stayed closer. There was a kind of peace that came with the long nights and early darkness. It reminded her of the value of quiet things, of rest, of warmth, of simply being. Sometimes she dreamed of her childhood home, of corridors long gone, of voices that no longer echoed. She dreamed of her sisters, of the garden where they played, of the songs they sang while weaving flower crowns. The dreams were not sad. They were soft and blurred, like faded tapestries. She woke from them slowly, her heart filled not with longing, but with gratitude. There were nights when sleep did not come easily. On those nights, she did not fight the wakefulness.
She let her thoughts wander gently through the rooms of memory. She remembered a meal shared by candlelight, the scent of bread fresh from the oven, a kiss on the forehead before battle, a laugh heard through a closed door. She let these thoughts drift like feathers settling. She knew her life had not been easy. It had not been grand in the way poets described, but it had been steady. It had been full. She had seen beauty and sorrow, love and disappointment. She had bent under the weight of duty, but she had never broken. And in that there was something noble, something strong in the quiet. When she wrote her will, she kept it simple. She asked that her books be passed on, that her garden be cared for, that a candle be lit each year on her name day. She left gifts not of gold, but of memory. Letters, stitched linens, a rosary worn smooth from decades of prayer. These were the things that had mattered to her, and she hoped they would matter to someone else someday. She did not expect statues or songs. She asked only for a quiet burial beside her husband, beneath the oak tree that had shaded them both in younger years. No fanfare, just a moment of stillness, and then the world would go on. But even as the world continued, a part of her remained, in the stories told at supper, in the way her descendants folded linens just so, in the gentle rhythm of daily life she had helped to shape. And that was enough.
Though her life seemed confined to stone walls and embroidered gowns, the noblewoman still lived under the larger shadow of belief. Faith was not merely personal, it shaped the very foundation of her daily duties, her thoughts, and even her fears. In the Middle Ages, religion was not a choice. It was a constant presence, as ordinary and unchanging as the turning of the seasons. From birth to death, every noblewoman moved through rituals that were meant to define her place in both this world and the next. Baptism came within days of being born. It was often the first formal moment of her life, her small body wrapped in linen as she was held over a basin and marked with water. Prayers were whispered. A name was given. It was not just a celebration, it was protection. In the minds of those around her, a child unbaptized might wander forever if death came too early. The ritual was urgent. It made her officially a soul worth saving. As she grew, her education, if she was fortunate enough to receive one, was shaped by Scripture. She learned to read Latin prayers long before she read anything else. She memorized the lives of saints, many of whom had suffered greatly
and had died young. Their stories were held up as models of virtue, pain, silence, obedience. These were qualities admired in women, and especially in holy women. The message was clear. To suffer quietly was not only expected, it was admired. Her days followed the rhythm of bells. They rang from the chapel, calling the household to prayer, reminding her of divine time. Morning prayers, noon prayers, evening prayers. She knelt on cold floors and folded her hands. She repeated words that had been spoken for generations. It was not always a question of belief, but of discipline. Prayer was duty. It marked her hours as surely as sunlight through the windows. She was taught that her body was a source of temptation, not just for others, but for herself. Modesty was not a suggestion, it was a shield. Her gowns were long, her hair covered. She was warned against vanity, against pride, against laughter that was too loud. Even joy had to be measured in case it became too much. Marriage, too, was tied to faith. The ceremony took place before a priest, under the watch of both God and family. The vows were binding. To love, yes, but more importantly, to obey. There was no easy exit. A marriage once made was considered sacred and final. If it became a burden, she bore it. That was her cross. She went to confession, sometimes weekly, sometimes more. Kneeling in shadow, she whispered her faults to a priest. Impatience, envy, doubt. She examined herself often, asking whether she had spoken too freely, whether she had taken too much comfort in worldly things. Her conscience was never entirely quiet. It was shaped by sermons, by scriptures, by the quiet disapproval in a bishop's eyes. Death was never far. She lit candles for the souls of the departed. She prayed for mercy, for others, and for herself. She kept a rosary by her bed, each bead worn smooth by use. Dreams of fire and judgment were not uncommon. The Church taught that the soul must be purified either in life or after. And so she fasted. She donated to the poor. She paid for prayers to be said on her behalf long after she would be gone. Pilgrimages were sometimes encouraged, long, difficult journeys to distant shrines. If her health allowed, she might make such a journey, not for adventure, but for redemption, to walk where a saint had walked, to pray at a tomb, to endure discomfort as a form of cleansing. The path was often muddy, her feet blistered, but she continued, because the act of walking was itself a prayer. She feared hell, but she feared scandal more. A woman accused of impiety could lose everything: status, safety, even her children. Rumors spread quickly, especially about women, so she was careful. Her public piety was not just personal devotion, it was protection. It shielded her from suspicion, from exile, from shame. And yet, for all the weight religion placed on her shoulders, it also gave her comfort. The rituals brought order, the prayers brought rhythm, the chapel brought silence. When the world became too loud, too cruel, she could retreat to the familiar words of the Psalms, to the flicker of candlelight, to the cool peace of stone walls. In those moments she was not a wife, nor a mother, nor a vessel of alliances. She was simply a soul. She found beauty in small things: a hymn sung softly by novices, the smell of incense, the illuminated letters in a prayer book. Some evenings she would read aloud to herself, moving her lips slowly, tasting each word as if it were sacred. The sound of her voice, alone in the room, felt like both company and prayer. On feast days, the entire household would attend Mass. She dressed in her finest, not out of vanity, but respect. The priest's voice echoed through the hall, rising and falling like waves.
A noble woman's life was filled with unspoken rules, most not written in any book, but deeply ingrained in behavior, in glances, in expectations. Even within her own household, her freedom was limited. The manner she oversaw was not entirely hers. It belonged to her husband or his family or the crown. She was its keeper, not its owner. She moved through rooms that echoed with duty, not desire. Every tapestry, every carved bench, every silver spoon reminded her of the hierarchy she served. She rarely walked alone. When she went into the village, she was accompanied by attendants, not for her safety, but for her reputation. The presence of witnesses ensured she remained above suspicion. A woman of her station could not be seen idling in the market, or speaking too long to a craftsman, or lingering by the church door.
Even kindness had to be measured. Too much, and it might be mistaken for familiarity. Too little, and it could be called pride. She was expected to entertain guests, but always with care. She served wine, but did not drink freely. She smiled, but did not laugh too loudly. She was gracious, but not flirtatious. Every movement was watched. Every word was weighed. Her performance was continuous, like a play with no curtain. When her husband hosted banquets, she sat beside him, offering food, exchanging pleasantries, but rarely speaking at length. Her presence was symbolic, a sign that the house was in order. She listened more than she talked. She nodded at the right moments. She laughed when others laughed, but often her thoughts drifted to the fire, to the candlelight on the walls, to the soft creak of wooden beams above her head. She had opinions, sometimes strong ones, but she had learned to keep them veiled, to suggest rather than state, to guide rather than command. A noble woman who spoke too directly risked being labeled troublesome, and once labeled, there was no defense. Her words would be twisted, her intentions questioned. So she became a master of hints, of glances, of pauses. She learned to make her meaning known without saying it out loud. Letters were her secret voice. On parchment, she could express what she dared not say in person. She wrote carefully, choosing words that were gentle but clear. She wrote to her sisters, to old friends in distant estates, to the women she once knew at court. In these letters, she shared her thoughts more freely about politics, about marriage, about the weight of her daily life. The letters were folded, sealed with wax, and sent off by messengers. Sometimes weeks passed before a reply came, but still she wrote. The act itself was a kind of freedom. She missed certain things, walking barefoot in the grass, singing without fear of judgment, speaking without editing every thought. These were small losses, but they accumulated. They became a kind of background ache. She rarely spoke of them. What was the use? Nostalgia was not encouraged. It was seen as a kind of weakness. Children offered moments of relief. With them, she could let the mask slip a little. She told them stories, let them sit on her lap, brushed their hair while humming quiet tunes. But even then, she was training them, teaching daughters how to stitch, how to curtsy, how to hold their tongues, preparing sons to lead, to speak, to assert. Childhood was short. Expectations came early. There were moments of genuine joy, watching a tree bloom in spring, seeing a servant succeed in their task, receiving news that a distant cousin had survived childbirth. These small moments glowed in her memory like candle flames. She held on to them.
In a world where most things were out of her control, these tiny joys mattered. She rarely traveled. Roads were long and dangerous. Permissions were required. She might visit a neighboring estate or accompany her husband to court, but such journeys were rare, and when they happened, they were exhausting. Long hours in a swaying carriage, poor roads, damp inns, the constant awareness that she must be on display, even in unfamiliar places. She often longed for the return home, where at least the shadows were familiar. She kept her belongings in order, her jewelry in a box lined with velvet, her hair combs wrapped in cloth, her prayer books stacked in quiet rows. She treasured these objects not for their value, but for their constancy. They did not question her. They did not require explanation. They simply were. She understood that aging would make her less visible. Younger women arrived with brighter eyes and quicker steps. She did not envy them. She pitied them. They did not yet know how narrow the path was, how quickly admiration could become judgment. She wanted to warn them, but warnings were rarely welcome, so she simply watched and remembered. Her relationship with her husband was shaped by expectation, not affection. They were respectful, sometimes even kind, but intimacy, in the true sense, was rare. She did not speak of loneliness. Few would have understood. It was not seen as a noblewoman's concern. She was clothed, fed, protected. What more could she want? At night, she sometimes lay awake, staring at the canopy above her bed. She listened to the wind, to the creak of the manor walls, to the distant bark of dogs. In those hours, she let her mind wander, not toward rebellion, not toward escape, but toward softness, toward memories of running as a girl, of reading poems at candlelight, of feeling the rain on her face before anyone told her to come inside. She had done everything required of her, managed a household, raised children, maintained appearances, but part of her wondered if that was all there was, not with bitterness, just with curiosity. Was there a version of her in another life who might have written books, who might have painted, who might have laughed freely without glancing first to see who was watching? She would never know. That version of herself belonged to dreams, to silence, to the pages of a life never written. But she held it gently.
Even in sleep, the noblewoman was not entirely free. Her dreams were shaped by the world around her, by duty, by caution, by the constant awareness of her place in society. Her bed, though grand and surrounded by heavy curtains, offered more comfort to the eyes than to the soul. It was a place to rest, but never to let go. The weight of her role followed her into the silence of the night. Morning began,
not with leisure, but with routine. A servant opened the shutters. The room filled slowly with gray light. A basin of cool water was brought in. She washed her face, not for refreshment, but for decency. She was always preparing for something, a meal, a visit, a prayer. Her body belonged not to comfort, but to expectation. Breakfast was modest: bread, perhaps a bit of cheese, watered wine, or weak ale. Meals were not about pleasure, but about function. Gluttony was frowned upon, especially for women. To eat too much was considered a moral failing. So she ate just enough, and she did it quietly, surrounded by others who watched, even if they did not speak. She inspected the manor after that, not as a ruler, but as a careful guardian. The pantry must be stocked, the linens counted, the fires tended. A noblewoman was not idle. Even if she did not work with her hands, she worked with her eyes, her mind, her sense of order. If something was out of place, she was expected to notice. If something was lacking, she was expected to correct it, softly, discreetly, but firmly. If her husband was away, at war, at court, or on a hunt, her responsibilities grew heavier. She became the temporary head of the household, but even then she moved within limits. She could not make bold decisions without consulting male advisors. She could not change policy. She could only maintain balance, hold things steady until he returned. In the garden, she walked slowly, not to enjoy the scent of herbs or the beauty of flowers, but to inspect the work of others. The hedges were trimmed, the herbs harvested, the path swept. Every detail reflected on her. A disorderly garden was a sign of a disorderly mind. Even nature had to be tamed. Sometimes she visited the sick, not because she was expected to show emotion, but because charity was a duty. She brought broth, blessed cloths, whispered prayers. Her presence was meant to be reassuring, a symbol of mercy, not of affection. She might sit beside a servant burning with fever and speak gently, but she could not stay long. Her time was always borrowed. She received visitors with grace, though rarely with ease. Other noble women arrived with their own smiles, their own silences, their own carefully chosen words. Conversation was an art form, measured, polite, full of meaning between the lines. No one spoke too plainly. Everyone remembered everything. A careless phrase today might become a rumor tomorrow. Fashion was another form of control. She wore what was expected, what was proper. Her gowns were heavy with meaning, modest but fine, restrained but detailed. Every ribbon, every brooch, every embroidery told a story about her status. A noble woman who dressed poorly was suspect, but one who dressed too richly could be called vain. She had to walk that narrow line, again and again. Music was allowed, though rarely spontaneous. A harp in the corner, a song sung softly by a lady in waiting. The melodies were delicate, controlled, often religious. Nothing too wild, nothing too joyful. Joy, like everything else, was to be regulated. She sometimes taught the younger girls, nieces, wards, daughters of allies. She taught them to read prayers, to hold a needle, to sit without fidgeting. She watched their faces and saw a glimpse of her younger self, hopeful, curious, not yet confined. She wanted to protect them, but she also knew they would one day carry the same burdens. There was no path out, only through. She received news of the world through letters and whispers. A cousin executed, a bishop promoted, a war breaking out far to the east. But it all felt distant. Her world was bounded by walls, by expectations, by time. She reacted not with emotion, but with quiet calculation. What did it mean for the family, for the estate, for her children? When the sun dipped low, she prepared for evening as she had prepared for morning, slowly, methodically. Her hair was brushed, her face cleaned, a fresh gown selected. She attended vespers. She bowed her head. She listened. Even as her body grew tired, she remained composed. Supper was more formal than breakfast, but not festive. Conversation was subdued. Candles flickered. Shadows stretched across the walls. The mood was solemn, almost sacred. She spoke when spoken to. She asked after the health of others. She expressed gratitude for the meal. She did not linger. After supper, she returned to her chamber. The servants undid her laces. Warm water was brought. The fire was stoked. A book might be read aloud, a saint's life, a collection of proverbs, or she might simply sit and sew, letting the needle move in and out, rhythmically, like breath. The sound of the thread passing through fabric was strangely comforting. Before bed, she prayed again, on her knees, hands folded, lips moving softly. She prayed for her children, for her husband, for the souls of the dead. She prayed for strength, not happiness, strength. That was what was asked of her. That was what she had learned to offer. And then, at last, she lay down, the curtains drawn, the candles extinguished, the room plunged into shadow. Her mind wandered briefly, through memory, through longing, through quiet questions she dared not speak out loud. But slowly, steadily, sleep came, not as a release, but as a pause. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again.
Time passed slowly for a noble woman. Seasons came and went, marked not by sudden change, but by quiet shifts. The garden turned green, then yellow, then bare. The air warmed, then cooled, then bit at her skin. She did not mark the years by age or event, but by what duties returned: the sowing, the harvest, the winter stores. One season blurred into the next. Her life followed a pattern so fixed it felt almost sacred. Birthdays were rarely celebrated. Names days were acknowledged with a prayer or a modest treat. But there were no grand cakes, no wrapped gifts. Joy, when permitted, came in small and quiet ways.
A letter received, a child's laughter, the flicker of sunlight on frost. These moments were not rare, but they were brief. She learned not to hold them too tightly. Sometimes her body betrayed her. Illness came often and left slowly. There were no antibiotics, no guaranteed cures. A cough could linger for months. A fever might mean days in bed, tended by silent servants with herbs and prayers. She accepted pain as part of living. Complaining was not encouraged. Strength, again, was the ideal. Silent, enduring strength. Pregnancy was its own trial. Each time brought hope and fear. Would the child live? Would she? No one asked if she wanted more children. That was not the question. Her duty was to bear them, raise them, and sometimes bury them. She learned to love each one while knowing they might not stay. It made her love quieter, deeper, almost hidden. Miscarriage was not spoken of. It happened often, but in whispers. She would bleed, weep quietly, and return to her duties. Grief was private. She might pray longer at the chapel, or sit in stillness for hours, but she would not speak of it aloud. Others understood. They had been there too, but still the silence remained. Her children grew, each in their own direction. Sons were sent away young to foster with other noble families, to train, to learn leadership. Daughters stayed longer, learning the art of being invisible and powerful at once. She watched them, guided them, and wondered what world they would inherit. Likely it would be just like hers. Marriage arrangements began early. Suitors were considered not for love, but for land, alliances, and reputation. Her daughter might cry, might beg to choose her own path, but the noblewoman could only offer comfort, not options. She understood that saying no was not truly an option, just like it hadn't been for her. She had friends, of a sort, other women who had made peace with their roles. They shared glances at gatherings, exchanged letters, offered silent support. But even friendships were careful. Too much closeness could breed gossip. Too much distance, and one might be seen as cold. It was a balance, like everything else. Religion offered structure. Days were marked by prayer hours, matins, lauds, vespers, compline. She didn't always feel spiritual, but she found comfort in the rhythm, the familiar words, the candle smoke rising in thin spirals, the carved wooden pews worn smooth by centuries of devotion. In the chapel, she felt small, but not alone. Confession was both relief and performance. She told her sins to the priest, impatience, doubt, pride. He listened, absolved, and instructed. She rarely confessed the deepest things, the griefs that had no name, the longings that felt improper. She kept those for herself. She believed God saw them anyway. The manner changed slowly over time. New tapestries were hung, a new servant arrived, a tree was cut down, another planted. She marked these changes without ceremony. The house lived as she did, quietly, dutifully, enduring. It creaked in the wind. It held its breath in winter. It absorbed stories in its walls. Occasionally, news came from far away. A king was crowned, a rebellion put down, a distant relative disgraced. These events felt unreal. They did not change her day-to-day life. Her world was the manor, the village, the church. Politics were a wind she could feel, but not direct. She sometimes wondered what it would feel like to travel far, to see cities, oceans, mountains. She had read about them, heard travelers speak of them, but it was not for her. Her world was enough because it had to be. Dreams, like joys, were kept modest. In her older years, she moved more slowly. Her joints ached, her eyesight dimmed, but with age came a certain freedom. Expectations softened. She was no longer expected to be beautiful, no longer expected to produce children. She became, in a way, more herself. She took comfort in routine. Morning light through the same window, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the scent of bread rising from the kitchen. Life was made not of grand moments, but of repetitions. And there was a peace in that, a steadiness. Sometimes she spoke to the younger women, offering advice, comfort, caution. She did not dramatize her life. She simply shared what she had learned, that silence could be strength, that survival was a kind of victory, that not all battles were fought with swords. When death came, it was not sudden. It crept in slowly, as a guest she had long prepared to receive. Her bed was surrounded by candles. Prayers were whispered. She held the hand of a child, now grown. She said little. There was little left to say. Her life had spoken for her. She was buried near the chapel, under a carved stone. Her name, her family, her virtues, etched into history. But the true story of her life lived elsewhere, in the quiet rooms she had walked through, in the linen she had folded, in the soft hum of lullabies long forgotten, in the memory of those who had once watched her smile and wondered what she was thinking. And so the manor remained. The seasons turned. Another woman would take her place. The duties would be passed on. The silence would continue. And somewhere in that silence, her story would linger, not loud, not grand, but steady, like the beat of a distant heart, still echoing through time.
The noblewoman's world was built on layers of stone, of silence, of unwritten rules. And while one life ended, another began. A younger woman, perhaps only 17, now stepped into the same role. She moved through the manor as if through a dream, wearing clothes she had not chosen, smiling at people she barely knew. But the walls knew her already. They had seen this before. The household adjusted, as it always did. A new mistress meant new rhythms, but the structure remained. Servants bowed, meals were served, the chapel echoed with quiet hymns. No one questioned the system. It was too old, too deeply woven. Everyone knew their place, and the young noblewoman would learn hers too. Her days began early. A knock on the door, a whispered greeting, the same rituals as before, washing, dressing, praying. But for her, everything still felt unfamiliar. Her fingers fumbled with the rosary. Her steps were cautious on the stone floor. The bed, though soft, never truly comforted. It was a new life, but not her own. She wrote letters with careful ink, guided by a tutor. Her handwriting was expected to be neat, her phrasing modest. She could not be too clever, nor too plain. Every word carried weight. Every sentence was a reflection of her upbringing, her family, her virtue. It was not just communication, it was performance. At meals, she observed more than she spoke. The steward reviewed supplies. The chaplain offered a short blessing. Her husband, older and often distracted, asked about the estate in broad terms. She responded politely, deferring to his knowledge. Her voice was not yet fully her own. It would come with time, if at all. She spent time with the household staff, partly to learn, partly to be seen. She inspected the linens, watched the kitchen at work, walked the storerooms in silence. She did not give orders at first. She simply watched. It was the beginning of a long education, one not taught in books, but in glances, in gestures, in noticing what went unsaid. In the evenings, she listened to music played by others, a lute, a soft voice, a song in Latin. She rarely sang herself. It was considered bold for a lady to perform unless asked. Instead, she sat with folded hands, eyes half lowered, listening to the melodies drift into the air like mist. They reminded her of stories her mother once told, of love, of longing, of saints and sorrow. Sometimes she sat by the window, the same window where the older noblewoman once rested. She looked out at the village. Smoke curled from chimneys. Children ran along muddy paths. Chickens pecked near doorways. It was not her world, but she was expected to care for it. She was its quiet guardian, even if the people below never knew her name. Her education continued. She studied the lives of saints, read moral tales, learned how to mix herbs for teas and remedies. A noblewoman was not expected to be a healer, but she was expected to know enough to care, especially when others were watching. A lady-in-waiting stayed close, offering guidance, adjusting her posture, reminding her of names and customs. The young noblewoman nodded, obeyed, and stored it all away. There was no space to rebel, only to adapt. When visitors arrived, she dressed with care, her gown pressed, her hair arranged, her speech rehearsed. Every appearance was an opportunity or a risk. One slip, one moment of nervousness, and the rumors might begin. She learned to speak slowly, to smile gently, to never interrupt, to be present but not too visible, confident but never dominant. Even in private moments, she felt the weight of observation, the way the servants glanced at her when she walked past, the way older women in the household judged her, her silence, her grace, her hands. Was she generous enough, modest enough, strong enough? She didn't know. She only knew that she was always being watched. At night, she lay in bed and stared at the carved ceiling above her. It bore symbols of her husband's family: lions, vines, saints. None of them were hers, but now they belonged to her life. Her identity was slowly being reshaped not by force, but by repetition, like water wearing away stone. She prayed for courage, for understanding. Sometimes she prayed just to feel less alone. Her words were quiet but sincere. She did not yet know what kind of woman she would become, but she had already begun the transformation. Duty had a way of shaping even the softest hearts into steady ones. There were moments of light, a kind gesture from a servant, a joke shared behind a fan, a letter from her sister. These were small gifts. They helped her breathe. They reminded her that beyond all the roles and duties, she was still someone. Young, curious, capable of feeling. And when she walked through the halls, her footsteps echoed alongside those of women who had come before her. Their names were etched on tapestries, on family trees, in quiet prayer books. They had endured, each in their own time. And now it was her turn. She did not need to be remarkable. She only needed to remain, to do her part, to carry the weight, to pass it on.
Her days settled into a rhythm, gentle and steady. The morning light filtering through the high windows, the sound of footsteps on cold stone floors, the scent of bread baking carried through the halls. These things became markers of time, more than clocks or calendars ever could. The noblewoman now understood what it meant to live by the pace of the house. She did not need excitement. She was not meant for it. Her life was built on predictability, on the repetition of duties, of rituals, of gestures so small they could hardly be seen. That was how a lady proved her strength, not in grand action, but in quiet mastery of 1,000 details. Each morning began with prayer. She knelt on the wooden floor, the chill biting at her knees. She murmured the same words, sometimes without thinking, but sometimes, on still mornings before the house truly woke, she meant every word. She prayed not just for grace or strength, but for clarity, for peace of mind, for steadiness in the face of days that felt endless. After prayers came correspondence. The ink flowed in measured strokes, thank you notes for gifts, letters of sympathy, inquiries about dowries, crops, marriages. These letters were not personal, but they mattered. They were the fabric that held the noble world together, a web of politeness, obligation, and subtle diplomacy. Sometimes she received letters from other noble women. They were rarely emotional, but often comforting in their familiarity. Shared concerns about wool shipments, advice about managing servants, reflections on their children. Between the lines, she sensed what they could not write, the loneliness, the fatigue, the small triumphs that no one else noticed. She sometimes walked the gardens alone. The trees did not speak, but they offered a kind of companionship. Their silence matched her own. The path wound past hedges, around fountains, beside a small pond where ducks floated without hurry. The seasons changed gently here, and so did she. In spring she oversaw planting, flowers for the manor, herbs for the kitchens, vegetables for the stores. She did not do the digging herself, but her presence mattered. It was expected. It showed that she cared, that she was involved, that she understood her role extended beyond embroidery and etiquette.
In summer, she inspected the linen rooms, the cellars, the storerooms. She kept careful records, noting what had been used and what needed replacing. A noblewoman did not simply exist in beauty. She managed an empire in miniature. Her household was her domain. To rule it well was an art form. Autumn brought the harvest. She stood with her steward watching the carts roll in from the fields. Barrels of grain, baskets of apples, bundles of wool. She blessed the workers, thanked the foreman, smiled at the children who lingered nearby. These were small acts, but they built loyalty, respect. Winter was the hardest. The manor grew dark and cold. Fires were lit early. Illness crept through the halls. Servants moved more slowly. The world outside the stone walls disappeared into snow and fog. It was during these months that she felt her loneliness most, that she remembered her mother's voice, her sister's laughter, the warmth of youth long faded. Sometimes she visited the sick. She carried broth, or a prayer, or simply her presence. Not all women did this, but she believed it mattered, that a noble heart required more than wealth or title. It required compassion, even when no one was watching. Her husband was often away, hunting, managing lands, meeting with other lords. When he was home, he was courteous, sometimes affectionate, but distant. Their marriage was not cruel, but neither was it close. It was functional. She accepted it. It was better than what many women endured. They had children. Each birth was a storm followed by stillness, the pain, the fear, the waiting, and then the relief or the sorrow. She did not take life for granted. She held her children close, but not too tightly. She knew how easily they could slip away. Her sons were taught Latin and swordsmanship. Her daughters learned music, embroidery, and silence. She watched them grow with pride and worry. What would become of them? Would they find kindness in their own marriages? Would they be strong enough to carry the same burdens? Sometimes at night she wondered what her life might have been in another time. If she had been born into a different class, if she had been a man, if she had had choices. But these thoughts drifted like smoke, visible for a moment, then gone. It did not do to dwell on what could never be. She found comfort in her chapel, in the familiar scent of wax and wood, in the flicker of candles, in the hymns she had sung since girlhood. The church offered no answers, but it offered order, and that was enough. To believe that life had meaning, even unseen. She rarely cried, not because she lacked sorrow, but because she had learned to carry it differently, like a stone hidden in a pocket, always there, but not always touched. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was still, she allowed herself a single tear. Then she folded the feeling away and slept. There were small joys, the feel of warm bread in her hands, a kind word from an old servant, the smell of lavender in summer, the sight of her daughter laughing. They were quiet, but they mattered. They made the weight of her role a little lighter. And in all things she endured. That was her gift, her legacy. She did not fight wars or write books, but she held a world together. Through patience, through wisdom, through presence. That was enough.
As the years passed, The noblewoman became more a part of the manor than the furniture or the tapestries. She no longer needed to be reminded of her duties. They were simply part of her, like breathing, like blinking. She moved through the halls with purpose, though never in a rush. There was no need to hurry. Nothing ever truly changed. She had grown into the role, not by ambition, but by absorption. Every corner of the house held her touch, quiet, invisible, but present. The linens bore her scent. The hearths were lit according to her habits. The kitchen cooked what she preferred. Even the servants adjusted their pace to her rhythm. She had long stopped hoping to be understood. It wasn't sadness, not exactly, more like acceptance, a kind of peace. She did not speak often, but when she did, her words carried weight. People listened, not because she shouted, but because she had learned when to speak and when to stay silent. Her daughters grew. They embroidered fine patterns and practiced the lute. They whispered in corners and looked out windows, dreaming of futures far away. She watched them with something close to tenderness, but also a deep unease. She knew too well what waited for them. Not dragons or villains, just the same duties, the same walls, the same slow fading into someone else's household. She tried to prepare them, not with warnings, but with steadiness. She taught them how to read between words, how to measure people without speaking, how to survive on little joys. It wasn't what they dreamed of learning, but it was what they would need. When the time came for their marriages, she packed their trunks with care. She stitched prayers into their linens, slipped rosemary into the folds of their gowns, held their faces for one last moment before letting them go. They were brave, or at least looked brave, and she did not weep, not then. The house felt quieter without them, not emptier, just different. The echoes had changed, the rhythm shifted, but her days continued. The sun still rose, meals were still served. There was always something to attend to, a sick maid, a broken chair, a dispute over salt. The manor's chapel became her second home. She spent long hours there, not always praying, sometimes just sitting, listening to the wind rattle the stained glass, watching dust swirl in shafts of light. There was comfort in that quiet. It asked nothing of her. The chaplain, an old man with kind eyes, occasionally read to her from the Psalms. His voice was slow, measured, never too loud. She didn't always follow the words, but the sound soothed her, like a familiar lullaby, like the voice of someone who didn't expect her to reply. She kept her household running as always.
The accounts were in order, the linen stores full, the servants respectful. There was little praise, but also little complaint, and in her world, that was success. Sometimes guests would come to the manor, distant cousins, traveling monks, minor lords. She entertained them with the same calm composure she had perfected. She poured wine. She asked polite questions. She nodded in all the right places. After they left, she returned to silence without regret. In her own room, she kept a small box of letters, tied with ribbon, stained with time. Most were from her daughters, some from her sister, a few from people long gone. She read them occasionally, not for news, but for remembrance, for proof that there had once been other lives in hers. Winter grew longer each year, or perhaps just harder to bear. The fires warmed less, the stairs felt steeper. Her hands ached when she embroidered, her feet swelled in her shoes, but she did not complain. She wore her discomfort like another layer of clothing, always present, but never discussed. She had a maid who had served her for nearly 2 decades. They rarely spoke of anything beyond tasks, but in the silence between them there was trust. The maid knew how the lady liked her tea, which shawl to bring, when to leave her alone. They shared no secrets, but shared everything else. Sometimes, as she looked into the fire, she thought of her mother, her hands, her voice, her scent. It had been so long, too long. She tried to remember her laugh, but couldn't. Only the feeling remained, a soft, warm presence in a world now so distant. She no longer feared dying, not because she was brave, but because she had grown used to absence. So many people had left before her, friends, family, even servants. Each departure left a small hole, but also a kind of map, showing her slowly how to go when it was time. She still found comfort in routine, still lit her own candles when she could, still sorted herbs in the pantry, still walked the garden path, even if only halfway. These small actions made her feel real, anchored, useful, alive. And sometimes, in rare moments, she smiled at a warm breeze, a bird at the window, a memory that came without sorrow. These were not bursts of joy, just flickers, but they were enough. She slept more lightly now, woke at strange hours, listened to the creak of the manor settling in the dark. It didn't frighten her. It felt like breathing, like the heartbeat of a place that had become part of her. And when dawn came, she rose slowly, moved to the window, looked out at the same view she had seen for decades, the same village, the same road, the same slow beginning of another quiet day, and she whispered a simple prayer, not for change, but for steadiness, for one more day of order, one more day of quiet usefulness, one more day of being what she had always been, the silent center of a world built on stillness.
There were no grand events that marked the passage of time, no celebrations, no declarations, just the slow changing of seasons and the turning of days, each almost identical to the last. The noblewoman's world was not made of milestones. It was made of repetition, and in that repetition, she found something like peace. She had lived long enough to know that drama and excitement were not promises of happiness. They were distractions, temporary flickers. What truly endured were the quiet things, a familiar routine, the soft rustle of linen, the glow of candlelight, the sound of rain on the roof. These things asked for nothing, but offered everything. The walls of the manor were no longer cold to her. She had walked them for so long they now felt like skin. The creaks in the floorboards were not flaws, they were voices. The drafts through the windows were reminders that she was still alive, still sensing, still part of this place. She no longer read for pleasure. Her eyes tired easily, but she listened when others read to her, chaplains, visitors, or even a servant when asked. The words themselves didn't always matter. It was the rhythm, the cadence, the way the sound filled the stillness, like a lullaby for the waking hours. Meals were simple now. She no longer craved the rich foods of her youth, a piece of bread, a bit of cheese, warm broth, a fig when the season allowed. These were enough. Her appetite, like so many things, had grown quieter. She sometimes sat in the great hall alone, her hands resting still in her lap. The hearth would burn low, the chairs around her empty, and yet she never felt abandoned. Loneliness had faded, replaced by something gentler, a kind of solitude that didn't wound. Memories visited her like soft-footed guests. She did not summon them. They came when they pleased. A voice from years ago, the texture of a dress she had once worn, a summer afternoon long forgotten but suddenly vivid. She welcomed these memories but did not cling to them. They came, they stayed, they left. She no longer worried about her appearance. Her mirror told no lies, but she stopped asking questions of it. Her hair, once brushed into careful shapes, now stayed bound in simple braids. Her gowns, once heavy with detail, were plain and warm. Comfort became her only vanity. Sometimes she sat by the window, watching the villagers pass on the road below. She did not know their names, but she had watched their lives unfold from a distance.
children growing into adults, old men disappearing, young couples walking hand in hand. It was a kind of story, unfolding in silence, without need for her participation. When storms came, she stayed still. She did not fear thunder or wind. She listened, counted seconds between lightning and its echo, watched shadows shift across the floor. The storm always passed. It always had. That was something she could believe in. She spoke less each year, but when she did, her voice was calm and low, like wind through reeds. Servants leaned in to hear her. They did not rush her. Her words, though few, had weight. They were not for display, but for use. In moments of stillness, she sometimes touched the carved wooden cross beside her bed. Its edges were worn smooth from years of quiet contact. She did not always pray, but the object itself was a comfort, a reminder of belief, even when belief felt distant. Letters still came, though less often. Her daughters now had their own households, their own children. Their writing was careful, thoughtful, but formal. She didn't mind. She read them slowly, twice, sometimes 3 times, and then placed them gently in her box, wrapped in a ribbon once blue, now gray. There was a cat that visited her chambers. No one knew where it came from or who fed it, but it appeared most evenings, curling near the hearth. She never named it, never called to it, but its presence pleased her. They shared a kind of silent understanding, 2 creatures who asked little and gave less, but still offered something wordless. The manner had changed. Some servants left, others arrived. Some rooms were closed, some tapestries faded, but she remained, the last constant, the still point in a world that gently shifted around her. She dreamed less, or perhaps she forgot her dreams. Sleep came slowly, but stayed longer, her breathing steady, her face soft in the candlelight. No restlessness, no tossing, just a quiet surrender to the night. Sometimes she heard voices in the hall, young voices, laughing, moving quickly. She smiled faintly. Let them run. Let them be loud. Let them believe the world was theirs. It once had been hers, too, though she had never shouted. And when she woke, she would rise slowly, sit at the edge of her bed, look toward the window, even if the sky was gray. She did not need the sun. The light of morning, no matter how faint, was enough. She no longer asked what purpose her life had served. That question had lost its sharpness. She had fed mouths, calmed storms of emotion, held hands through fever, smoothed quarrels with a glance. These things were not recorded in books, but they mattered. They had shaped her world. And she had endured, not with fire or fury, but with presence, with stillness,
with patience. That was her legacy. That was her strength.
There came a time when she no longer needed to oversee every detail of the household. Others knew what to do. The rhythms she had established continued without her direct hand. Bread was baked, floors were swept, beds were turned. It all unfolded as if she were still at the center of it, even when she no longer moved through the halls as often. The younger servants had never known her in her youth. To them, she had always been old, always calm, always distant. They spoke of her with quiet respect, almost as if she were a spirit rather than a person, someone who existed in rooms they rarely entered, someone who heard everything, even when she did not speak. She did not mind this. She had long stopped needing to be understood. There was an armchair in her chamber near the window, worn, soft, shaped by years of use. That was where she spent most of her days now, wrapped in a shawl, her hands resting quietly, sometimes folded, sometimes open on her lap. She did not fidget, she did not sigh. She simply sat, looking out, watching the wind play in the trees or the shadows shift across the garden wall. Her body, once strong enough to birth children, manage estates, and endure long rides, had grown soft and slow. Her joints ached, her steps shortened, her breath came in shallower rhythms, but still she moved when she could, slowly, deliberately, like the turning of pages in a heavy book. Her hair had silvered completely. Her voice, when she used it, was thinner, but no less certain. She no longer gave orders, only observations, only reminders, only occasional questions, softly spoken. Each day looked much like the one before, but that did not bother her. Predictability brought comfort. The morning tea, the quiet brushing of her hair, the same hymn sung softly by the maid as she tended to her mistress. These small rituals were like anchors. She clung to them gently. Her daughters rarely visited now. Their letters came still, but less frequently. The ink was rushed. The news was practical. One had taken ill. Another's son was to be knighted. A festival had passed. A chapel was being repaired. All things she read with calm acceptance. She did not ask for more. Her thoughts drifted often, not in confusion, but in a slow meandering, like a stream wandering through flat land. She remembered things in pieces, a dress she had worn to a feast, the way snow had looked on a stone balcony, a candle burning low as she nursed a child. They came and went. She did not chase them. They did not need to be whole to be beautiful. Sometimes she whispered to herself, not words really, just sounds, like breathing with purpose, like humming without melody, a way to remind herself that she was still present, still real, still anchored. When she was too tired to sit by the window, the maid moved the chair closer to the hearth. There she would rest with her eyes half closed, listening to the fire crackle.
That sound had always comforted her, even in childhood, even during storms. The fire did not speak, but it stayed. On rare occasions, a visitor would come from far away, someone who had known her once, an old cousin, a traveling priest. They would sit awkwardly for a time, trying to bridge the gap that years had stretched between them. She offered them tea, they offered her news, and then they left, touched by the quiet dignity of her presence, unsure if they would ever return. She did not feel regret. She had let go of ambition long ago. She had seen too much to believe in perfect endings. She had learned that most stories simply faded rather than closed, that life did not tie things up neatly. It simply drifted on, like mist over fields. She still touched her prayer beads, though she did not count them. She still opened the Psalter, though she did not always read the words. It was the gesture that mattered, the habit, the familiar weight in her hands. A lifetime of repetition had become its own kind of devotion. There were birds that nested in the ivy outside her window. She listened to their calls, not with curiosity, but with affection. They were a reminder that the world went on, that nests were built, eggs hatched, wings stretched. She had once done the same. The manor's walls, once whitewashed and clean, had taken on the patina of age. They cracked slightly in places. Moss grew in corners. But nothing crumbled. Nothing fell. Like her, the manor endured not by resisting time, but by accepting it. When the weather was warm, they wheeled her out into the garden. She sat under a tree, hands in her lap, eyes closed, face turned toward the sun. She did not speak during these hours, but the warmth pleased her, the smell of the herbs, the rustling of the breeze. These were enough. Night came earlier now, or it simply felt longer. Candles were lit sooner, curtains drawn tighter. The house fell into silence quickly. She did not mind. The dark no longer frightened her. It softened everything, made the world easier to bear. And when she finally closed her eyes each evening, she did so without fear. She had lived her life quietly, steadily, and with care. She had known duty and sorrow, love and loss, silence and meaning. She had not changed the world, but she had shaped the corner of it entrusted to her. That was enough.
There were fewer voices in the halls now, fewer footsteps, fewer doors opening and closing. The manor was not abandoned, but it had quieted, like a candle nearing the end of its wax. Life still moved, but more slowly, more gently, like breath during sleep. She noticed the silence, but it did not disturb her. In fact, she welcomed it. It gave her space to listen to other things, the sound of her own heartbeat, the distant church bells, the gentle clink of dishes from the kitchens. These small, steady noises were like a lullaby that never stopped. She had stopped measuring time by days or hours. Seasons were her only clock now. The weight of blankets in winter, the smell of blossoms in spring, the buzzing of flies in summer, the yellowing of leaves in autumn. These were all she needed to know where she was in the year. The servants who remained had been with her for many years. They did not rush. They knew her rhythms. They understood what she needed without words. They opened the curtains slowly, poured her tea quietly, adjusted her shawl with soft hands. Their care was like a second skin. She no longer dressed in the clothes of status. Her gowns were simple now, soft linen, dark wool, old laces. She had no more need for jewels or embroidery. The world no longer watched her, and she no longer performed for it. There was a freedom in that, a release from expectation. When she looked into the fire, she did not see visions. She did not dwell on what might have been. She simply watched the flames, how they moved without hurry, how they consumed without apology, how they warmed even as they faded. There was something truthful about fire. It did not pretend. She thought often of hands, the hands of others, her mother's years ago, brushing her hair, the midwife's bloodied and sure when she gave birth, her husband's calloused from sword and saddle, her own hands, younger once, firm and clever, now trembling slightly, spotted with time. She liked to have her hands held, though she never asked. Sometimes the maid would do it without being prompted, just reach across and rest her fingers over hers. It was enough. The weight, the warmth, a kind of silent kindness. Food was lighter now. Gruel, broth, a bit of pear. Her appetite had faded, but not her enjoyment of simple things. A warm cup, a soft texture, a taste that reminded her of something she couldn't quite name. These were the last pleasures of the senses. She no longer visited the chapel, but they brought the chaplain to her. He spoke softly, without preaching. He knew she preferred silence to sermons. Sometimes he read a psalm. Sometimes they just sat together, two people, no longer young, surrounded by echoes and incense. Dreams came in flashes now, not stories but images. A green field, a child's laughter, the hem of a blue dress trailing over stone, the sound of hooves in the distance. They did not frighten her, nor did they comfort. They simply were. She rarely asked questions anymore. The world outside her room had grown distant. She no longer needed to know who ruled, what wars were fought, or which feast day was coming. The present moment was her entire kingdom, a room, a window, a chair, and the slow beat of time. On days when the sun was strong, she asked to have the window opened, just a little, enough to feel the breeze, to smell the earth. Sometimes a bird would sing nearby, or a bee would hover and dart away. She watched these things not with surprise, but with quiet appreciation. They were the world's way of visiting her. A book sat by her bedside. She hadn't read it in months, but she liked knowing it was there. It had been with her for years. The spine cracked, pages softened. a history of saints, though she remembered little of it now. It wasn't the content that mattered. It was the memory of reading, the comfort of holding something solid. The room held memories too, though not like ghosts, more like layers. Her children had played here. She had wept here, laughed here, waited here. It had been a chamber of beginnings and endings. Now it was only a room of rest, a place where things slowed down and softened. There were times she did not speak for a whole day. No one minded. Words were not always needed. Her gaze was enough, a nod, a raised eyebrow, a slow breath. These had become her language, and those who loved her understood. She sometimes thought of the other noble women she had known. Some had died young, some had married again, some had simply disappeared from memory. She did not envy or pity them. Each life had unfolded in its own quiet way. None had truly been free. None had truly failed. Her world had been narrow, but it had been hers. She had endured its limits, bent within them, found ways to create space even when it felt impossible. That was a kind of strength, one that did not appear in songs or tapestries, but mattered nonetheless. When the candles burned low and the night wrapped tightly around the manor, she often lay awake, eyes open in the dark, not afraid, not waiting, just present, just there, breathing, thinking, remembering, listening to the stillness like a final lullaby. She did not speak of death. She did not fear it. It would come as everything came, not with drama, not with warning, just as another part of the quiet rhythm she had always known, like sleep or dusk or snow beginning to fall. And when that moment came, she hoped only for one thing, that it would be like the rest of her days, soft, unhurried, gentle.
The final season of her life arrived without announcement. There was no moment of realization, no dramatic turn, just a slower waking, a deeper sleep, a longer pause between thoughts. Time did not stop, it simply thinned, like mist drifting away at dawn. Those who cared for her noticed. The maid who had brushed her hair every morning now did so more gently, with longer strokes. The steward no longer asked questions. He simply waited for a nod or a blink. The chaplain stayed longer after prayers, sitting quietly, hands folded, as if watching over a sacred flame flickering low. The sounds of the manor were even softer. Conversations were whispered, footsteps muffled. It was as if the house itself understood, as if the stones and beams had decided to hold their breath with her. She spent more time asleep now, but her rest was not troubled. Her face was peaceful. Sometimes her lips moved slightly, as if reciting something, or speaking to someone only she could see. No one interrupted. These were private moments, and they deserved respect. Her dreams seemed to lengthen. The past returned in pieces. Her mother's voice calling her in from the fields, the scent of her first newborn, the velvet weight of a wedding gown she had once worn.
These memories did not bring sorrow. They came like distant bells, soft, fading, but beautiful in their own way. She no longer asked for the window to be opened, but the maid still cracked it slightly, just in case. The breeze no longer stirred her shawl, but it moved the curtains gently, like a hand brushing over old pages. Outside, the ivy climbed steadily, unconcerned with time. The psalter remained by her bedside, though she no longer touched it. The book had become part of the room now, like the candle holder or the folded linens. She did not need to read the prayers anymore. She had lived them. Food was now spooned carefully into her mouth, and sometimes not at all. She rarely drank more than a few sips, but no one forced her. There was no need. She was not suffering. She was simply drifting further from the weight of her body. She no longer spoke. Her voice had faded gently, like a song at the end of a long night. But her eyes still opened, they still saw. And when they met the gaze of someone she loved, there was still something there. Gratitude, perhaps, or peace, or quiet understanding. The hearth was kept burning, even though she no longer asked for warmth. It had become symbolic now, a flickering presence, to honor the life that had once burned so steadily. Those who sat near it found comfort, as if it echoed her spirit in the room. She had become more memory than motion, more presence than person. But no one mourned her yet. Instead, they kept watch. They came to sit in silence, not to say goodbye, but to be near her, to share in the calm that had always surrounded her, now more deeply than ever. One morning she did not open her eyes. The maid waited, then touched her hand. There was no change in her breathing, no sign of struggle. She was simply still. The stillness deepened, settled, and remained. Word passed slowly through the household. No one cried loudly. No one rushed. The silence that followed was not of shock, but of reverence. She had not died dramatically. There was no storm, no final speech, no sudden gasp. Her death was as quiet as her life, like a candle extinguishing itself after hours of steady glow. The chaplain said the prayers she knew she loved, though he did not expect her to hear. The steward placed a sprig of rosemary on the bed. The maid wept quietly as she folded the linens one last time. Each gesture was small, but full of meaning. They dressed her in the simplest gown she owned, pale linen, clean and soft. No rings, no necklace, only a ribbon in her hair, the same color as the sky just before dawn. She looked peaceful, not asleep, but settled, like something ancient returned to the earth. The chapel bells rang, not in mourning, but in recognition. The life of a woman who had endured much, who had spoken little, who had shaped the lives of others quietly and steadily, had reached its close. She was not buried with grandeur, no marble tomb, no elaborate epitaph, just a simple stone, her name carved plainly, the date of her birth and the day she left. There were no titles, no achievements listed, only the truth, that she had lived, and that was enough. The manor continued. Seasons changed. A new lady arrived. New footsteps echoed in the halls. New children laughed in the garden. but the quiet remained. The rhythm she had once shaped held fast. Her touch lingered in the folds of daily life, and in the stillest hours of the night, when wind brushed against the window panes and firelight danced on old walls, those who lived there sometimes felt something gentle, something calm, something like memory resting in the air. The noblewoman was gone, but not forgotten. She had endured, she had mattered, she had rested, and now she slept.